Okay, so you've all sent us a bunch of articles, and they're all about Microsoft Entra ID
Yeah.
from Microsoft Learn.
Yeah, lots of good stuff in there.
So we thought, let's do a deep dive and try to, kind of cut through some of that technical stuff and just get to what is Microsoft Entra ID? And more importantly, why should you even care?
Yeah.
Right. So basically, Microsoft Entra ID lets your people get to all the different things that they need access to,
Mm,
whether those things are, outside of your control, like Microsoft 365,
right.
or thousands of other SaaS applications, or things that you manage internally, like your company intranet, or some
Yeah.
custom cloud apps you've built.
Yeah, and that's really the interesting thing is that it kind of brings it all together, right? It's not just about how you reach out to the outside world. It's also about how you kind of govern access inside your own little world.
Right.
So that unified approach is a powerful concept.
Okay, so let's dive in a little bit to who actually uses this and why they should care. So the articles really helpfully kind of break this down by role.
Yeah.
So first up, IT administrators.
Yeah, so for IT admins, it's really like a central control panel for them to determine who gets access to what.
Right.
So you can imagine setting very specific access rules based on your business requirements. For example, they talk about being able to enforce multi-factor authentication for your important resources. So, that's a real step up in your security.
Yeah, and they also talk about the benefit of not just tightening security,
Yeah.
but also making life easier for the admin.
Exactly.
They talk about how it can automate the process of creating, updating, and removing user accounts, which is called user provisioning, between your existing Windows Server AD, Active Directory on-prem, and cloud applications,
Right.
including Microsoft 365. So that sounds like a huge efficiency win.
Yeah, and if we kind of zoom out and think about it from a broader perspective, it's really about establishing that strong security
Mhm.
and being able to meet those compliance requirements, right? So it gives you the tools to really protect user identities, their credentials, and gives you that control and visibility.
Right.
And for any IT admins out there listening, they even mention a free 30-day trial
Oh, nice.
of the P1 or P2 level, which is fantastic.
Yeah, it's a great way to just get in there and kind of kick the tires.
Absolutely.
Now, what about the folks who are actually building the applications, the developers? What does this mean for them?
Yeah, for developers, they can actually use Microsoft Entra ID as a standards-based authentication provider.
Okay.
So what that really means is they don't have to go out and build their own complex login system.
Right.
They can just rely on Microsoft Entra ID to do the work of verifying users based on their existing credentials.
Right.
And that really allows them to do this concept called single sign-on, where you can just have a single set of credentials and it just works everywhere.
Right. Nobody wants to have to remember a million different usernames and passwords for everything.
Exactly. And it goes even further, right? So they can also use Microsoft Entra APIs. So that's basically ways to access data, to create more personalized experiences in their applications based on information about the organization. And they even point developers to this resource called Microsoft Entra ID for developers to learn more. And again, they mentioned the free trial.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
So IT admins have all this control and security.
Mhm.
Developers can, do logins in a really streamlined way.
Right.
What about the rest of us who are already working with, with Microsoft Cloud Services?
Yeah, so this is where it gets really interesting, and it might be an aha moment for some listeners. If your organization already subscribes to Microsoft 365, Office 365, Azure, or Dynamics CRM Online, you're already using Microsoft Entra ID, your existing tenant. And we can think of a tenant as kind of like your organization's neighborhood, your private, secure neighborhood within the larger Microsoft Cloud City, is automatically a Microsoft Entra tenant.
Uh-huh. So it's like if you're using those services,
Right.
it's already there.
Already there. Yeah,
It's kind of quietly working behind the scenes.
exactly.
And you can immediately start managing access to your integrated cloud apps through that existing foundation.
Yeah, exactly. It's not some separate thing you need to go and buy. If you're already in that Microsoft Cloud ecosystem, you already have the basics.
That's a really good point, a really good clarification. So let's talk about the different levels of Microsoft Entra ID.
Yeah.
So the free version versus the paid licenses.
Right. So the source material really lays out this tiered approach, and it's pretty straightforward. Everyone who uses those Microsoft Online Business Services automatically gets what they call Microsoft Entra ID free,
Okay.
and that provides that baseline, like the foundation for signing in and, starting to protect your identities.
So what does that free tier give you? What are the core things you get?
Yeah, so the free tier actually has quite a lot. User and group management. So that's the basic ability to organize your users, right?
Right.
It includes on-premises directory synchronization. That's where you connect your existing Active Directory on-premises to the cloud, so you can have this kind of unified identity.
Hmm.
You get basic reports. You get self-service password change, but that's only for cloud users.
Okay.
And then you get that single sign-on capability we talked about for Azure, Microsoft 365, and a bunch of popular SaaS apps. So, that's a pretty strong foundation to start with.
Okay. So that's the free level.
Right.
What's the next step up?
So the next step up is Microsoft Entra ID P1, and that builds on all those free features. And this is where it really starts to get into more complex scenarios, especially if you have like a hybrid environment where you've got things living on-prem and you've got things living in the cloud.
Right.
So this really enables that hybrid user access where they can use a single identity to access all those resources.
So what are some of the more advanced administrative tools that you get with P1?
Yeah, so you get things like dynamic membership groups, where group membership is automatically updated based on rules that you define.
Okay.
You get self-service group management, where users can actually manage some of those groups themselves.
Okay.
It includes Microsoft Identity Manager, which is for more sophisticated identity lifecycle management. And then it also includes this capability called Cloud Writeback, where if a user changes their password in the cloud, that change can be written back to your on-premises Active Directory.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So that's P1. That sounds like, for bigger organizations or more complex organizations or organizations that have, more stuff going on.
Right.
That adds a lot of flexibility, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then there's P2.
So then there's P2, and P2 builds on free and P1, and it adds in more advanced security and governance capabilities. So the big thing here is this thing called Microsoft Entra ID protection, which provides risk-based conditional access. So you can think of that as like an intelligent security guard that evaluates how risky each sign-in attempt is,
Right.
and applies policies based on that risk.
So it's really a proactive approach to security.
Yeah, exactly.
Rather than just kind of setting rules and assuming everything's fine.
Right. And then it also includes privileged identity management, or PM,
Okay.
which is really about managing those administrative privileges, right? So being able to discover who has those high-level privileges, being able to restrict their use, monitor their activity, and even have this thing called just-in-time access,
Okay.
where they only get those privileges when they need them for a limited amount of time, which reduces your attack surface quite a bit.
Right. It's just minimizing the amount of scanning high level access.
Exactly.
Yeah. So and then they mentioned some add-on licenses, right? Some things that are beyond the core P1 and P2.
Yeah. So on top of P1 and P2, you can add this thing called Microsoft Entra ID Governance,
Okay.
which is a set of advanced identity governance features. So if you're already using P1 or P2 and you want to take it to the next level, you can add that on.
Okay. What about managing permissions across different cloud platforms? Because most people are not just using one cloud provider.
Yeah, and that's where this thing called Microsoft Entra Permissions Management comes in. And that's described as a CIM, a Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management Solution.
Okay.
And the big selling point there is that it gives you visibility across Azure, AWS, and GCP, Google Cloud. So if you're operating in a multi-cloud world, this could be a real game changer.
Right. Which a lot of people are these days.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So, and then they also mentioned some pay-as-you-go options.
Right. So this is where it gets into, really specific use cases. They mentioned two in particular. One is called Microsoft Entra Domain Services.
Okay.
And that allows you to join Azure virtual machines to a domain without having to set up your own domain controllers in Azure, which can be really complicated.
Right.
And then the other one is Microsoft Entra Business to Customer, or B2C.
Okay.
And that's really tailored for identity and access for your customer-facing applications.
Gotcha. And they actually point you to some docs for that.
Yeah, they point you to the Azure AD B2C documentation to learn more.
Okay. So it sounds like you can really tailor Microsoft Entra ID to your specific needs.
Yeah, lots of flexibility there.
Now, what about the actual cost?
Yeah, so that's a great question.
Right.
And the article, they're smart. They kind of punt on that one. They say,
Right.
go to the Microsoft Entra pricing page or the Microsoft Entra forum for the most up-to-date cost information
Right.
because pricing can change, right?
Yeah.
So always good to go to the source.
Right. Agreed. Okay. So we've talked about who uses it
Mm.
and the different licensing options.
Mm.
So let's dig into like the actual toolbox, like the array of features that this thing provides.
Right.
And the article is really helpful because they kind of break it down into these categories,
Yeah.
which is useful for understanding what does what.
Yeah, nice and organized.
So the first one is application management.
Right, and this is really about, managing access to all those applications that we were talking about.
Right.
So things like the application proxy, which provides secure remote access to those on-premises applications.
Yeah.
So if you've got users working remotely and they need to get to something that's living on your network,
Right.
the application proxy can help you do that securely.
Very important in today's world.
Absolutely, yeah. It includes single sign-on capabilities. It includes the My Apps portal, which is like a central hub for users to access all of their applications that they're authorized to use.
Right.
And then just management of a whole bunch of SaaS applications. And they even point you to the Microsoft Entra application proxy documentation to learn more about that.
Okay. And then the next category is authentication.
Right. And this is really about how your users prove that they are who they say they are.
Mm-hmm.
So this includes things like self-service password reset. That can be a huge time saver for your IT help desk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Multi-factor authentication, really important these days, adds an extra layer of security on top of your password.
Right.
You can actually have a custom banned password list.
Right. Okay. So you can, encourage people to use stronger passwords.
Right.
And then smart lockout, which is designed to help you prevent those brute force attacks where people are just trying to guess passwords over and over again. Yeah. And there's a whole bunch of documentation on that. The Microsoft Entra authentication documentation.
Great. And then there's Microsoft Entra ID for developers, which we talked about a little bit before.
Yeah, so that's really all about giving developers the tools they need to build applications that can sign in Microsoft identities.
Right.
And get tokens to access Microsoft Graph and all sorts of other APIs.
Uh-huh.
And the Microsoft Identity Platform documentation, that's where they should go.
Okay.
To learn all about that.
Great. Then there's business to business or B2B.
Right, and this is really all about how do you manage guest users, external partners, while maintaining control over your own data, right?
Right.
Really important for collaboration these days, and there's a whole bunch of documentation on that. The Microsoft Entra B2B documentation. Okay, and then the kind of counterpart to that is business to customer or B2C.
Right, and that's really all about customizing those sign-up, sign-in profile management experiences for your customer-facing apps.
Okay.
So think about, if you've got a website where customers need to log in, B2C can really help you make that a good experience, and they point you to the Azure AD B2C documentation for that.
Great. Okay. Conditional access. That sounds like another important piece.
Yeah, really powerful.
So what is that all about?
So conditional access is really about being able to manage access to your cloud applications based on various conditions. So think about things like where the user is coming from, what kind of device they're using, the risk level of their sign-in. So for example, you could say if somebody's trying to access really sensitive data from outside the company network, they have to do multi-factor authentication.
Makes sense.
So, you can really get very granular with those policies. And there's lots of documentation on that. The Microsoft Entra conditional access documentation.
Okay, great. Then there's device management.
Right. And this is really about controlling how those devices, whether they're company managed or personal devices, can access your corporate data.
Right.
And in today's BYOD world, bring your own device. Yeah. This is a big deal. And the Microsoft Entra device management documentation will tell you all about that.
Great. And domain services, which we touched on before with the pay-as-you-go stuff. So that's basically letting you join Azure virtual machines to a domain without having to manage domain controllers.
Exactly, yeah. So it's simplifying that whole setup, and there's more in the Microsoft Entra domain services documentation.
Great. Enterprise users, that's kind of a a broad category.
Yeah, so enterprise users is really about managing those internal users.
Right.
So being able to manage their licenses, control what applications they have access to,
Right.
and then being able to delegate administrative tasks using groups and roles. So, there's a whole area of documentation on that, the Microsoft Entra user management documentation.
Okay, great. And hybrid identity is something that a lot of organizations have to grapple with, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So how does Microsoft Entra ID help with that?
So Microsoft Entra ID provides these tools called Microsoft Entra Connect and Connect Health.
Okay.
And what these tools do is they allow you to have a single identity that can be used to authenticate and be authorized to access resources, whether they live in the cloud or on premises.
Right.
So you get this kind of seamless experience.
Seamless is good.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's a whole area of documentation dedicated to that, the hybrid identity documentation.
Okay, great. And then identity governance. That sounds like kind of a big bucket.
Yeah, so identity governance is really all about, how do you manage identities in a compliant way? And so P2 includes some basic capabilities around that: privileged identity management,
Okay.
access reviews, entitlement management. But if you really want to go all in on identity governance, you would look at Microsoft Entra ID governance,
Okay.
and that builds on top of those P1 and P2 features.
Okay.
And there's documentation on that, and there's a breakdown of the features by license
Right.
that you can find as well.
Great. And then Microsoft Entra ID protection. That sounds important.
Yeah, so this is really all about security. It's about proactively identifying vulnerabilities that might affect your organization's identities,
Right.
allowing you to configure policies to respond to suspicious activity.
Right.
So, if something fishy is going on,
Sure.
this can help you, take action and, remediate the problem. And there's a whole set of documentation just on that, the Microsoft Entra ID protection documentation.
Okay.
Mm.
And then managed identities for Azure resources. So this sounds like another way to just kind of simplify security for cloud apps.
Yeah, so this is, it basically gives your Azure services an automatically managed identity in Microsoft Entra ID.
Okay.
So what that means is that they can authenticate to other Azure services that support Microsoft Entra ID, things like Key Vault, for example,
Right.
without you having to embed credentials in your application code.
Oh, that's really slick.
Yeah, so it really streamlines that secure communication,
Mhm.
and the documentation on that is called What is Managed Identities for Azure Resources?
Okay, great. And then privileged identity management, or PM, we talked about that a little bit when we were discussing P2.
Right.
But yeah, it sounds like that's a really important piece just for making sure that administrative privileges are used in a safe way.
Yeah, and it's not just for Microsoft Entra ID. It also works for Azure, Microsoft 365, and Intune.
Right.
So, it's a pretty powerful feature.
Very powerful. Yeah.
And the Microsoft Entra Privileged Identity Management documentation will tell you all about it.
Okay. And then monitoring and health, kind of goes without saying, but
Yeah.
what kind of insights does Microsoft Entra ID give you there?
So this is really all about visibility, right? So it gives you visibility into the security and usage patterns within your environment. So
Yeah.
you can see, who's logging in from where, what they're accessing.
Right.
Are there any suspicious activities?
Right.
It's really important to be able to monitor that. And there's a whole set of reports and dashboards that you can use to do that. And all that is in the Microsoft Entra monitoring and health documentation.
Okay. And last but certainly not least, workload identities.
Right. And this is really all about giving identities to non-human things.
Okay.
So think about applications, services, scripts, containers. These things also need to be able to authenticate and access other services. And so workload identity is how you do that.
Okay.
And there's a great FAQ on that.
Okay. Perfect.
Wow.
That's a lot. There's a lot of features.
Yeah.
So it's clear that this is a really, this is a big product. It's powerful.
Yeah.
And it can do a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, to really be able to navigate the documentation and understand all the different concepts,
Yeah.
the article also provides a helpful glossary of key terms.
Yeah, because there's a lot of jargon, right?
Oh, there is.
So it's good to have a kind of a common understanding of what all those terms mean.
Right.
So let's break down some of those terms.
Okay. Yeah, let's define some
So the
stuffs.
first one is identity.
Okay.
At its most basic, it's anything that can be authenticated.
Okay.
So that could be a user, like a person with a username and password,
Right.
but it could also be an application or a server that authenticates using, some kind of secret or a certificate.
Okay.
So it's a very broad term.
Okay. And then account.
So an account is basically an identity that has data associated with it
Okay.
and permissions. So you can't have one without the other.
Right.
So your identity has a profile, it has group memberships, it has access rights assigned to it.
Right.
That's all part of your account.
Okay. So what's a Microsoft Entra account?
So a Microsoft Entra account, sometimes you'll also hear it called a work or school account,
Okay.
is an identity that's been created either through Microsoft Entra ID or another Microsoft cloud service, like Microsoft 365.
Okay.
And those identities are stored in Microsoft Entra ID,
Right.
and they're accessible to your organization's cloud subscriptions.
Okay. So we also encounter all these different types of administrators.
Yeah, there's a lot of them.
Right. So let's define the roles.
Okay.
What's an account administrator?
So an account administrator is a role that's associated with a Microsoft subscription.
Okay.
They're basically the billing owner. They have the authority to manage all subscriptions under that account. So they're like the top level administrator for billing purposes.
Okay. And then there's the service administrator.
So a service administrator is a role that gives you control over all Azure resources within a subscription,
Okay.
including who has access.
Right.
And that's equivalent to having the owner role at the subscription scope.
Okay. And then there's just the owner role.
Right. So the owner role is part of Azure RBAC, role-based access control,
Okay.
and they can manage everything within their assigned scope, including granting access to other users.
Okay. And then what's a Microsoft Entra global administrator?
So a Microsoft Entra Global Administrator is a role that's created by default. When you set up a Microsoft Entra tenant,
Okay.
they have the highest level of privileges,
Right.
including the ability to assign other admin roles.
Right.
So they're like the super admin. You can have multiple global administrators, but it's a very powerful role.
Okay. So moving on,
Yeah.
Azure subscription.
So an Azure subscription is basically how you pay for Azure cloud services.
Okay.
You can have multiple subscriptions,
Right.
and they're usually linked to a credit card or some other payment method.
Okay. And now the big one, tenant.
Yeah, so tenant is a really important concept to understand. It's basically your organization's dedicated and trusted instance of Microsoft Entra ID.
Okay.
It's created when you sign up for a Microsoft cloud service,
Right.
and it represents your organization, and it's primarily used for managing those internal resources. So sometimes it's called a workforce tenant.
Okay.
It's different from an external tenant, which is something you would use for, customer-facing applications.
Okay. So, and then within that, there's single tenant and multi-tenant.
Yeah, so single tenant is where your Azure tenant accesses services in an environment that's dedicated to your organization.
Okay.
Multi-tenant is where your Azure tenant accesses services in a shared environment across multiple organizations.
Okay. And a Microsoft Entra directory, how does that relate to the tenant?
So the Microsoft Entra directory is the directory service that lives within each Azure tenant.
Okay.
It contains all the users, groups, applications,
Right.
and it's where all the identity and access management stuff happens.
Okay. And a custom domain.
So a custom domain is where you can add your organization's business domain names to Microsoft Entra ID.
Okay.
So instead of using, your company.onmicrosoft.com,
Right.
you can use yourcompany.com.
Right.
So it looks more professional.
That makes sense. Yeah. And then finally, the Microsoft account or MSA.
Yeah, so Microsoft accounts are those personal accounts that you use for consumer services
Yeah.
like Outlook.com, OneDrive, Xbox,
Right.
and those are actually stored in a completely separate system.
Okay.
They're not stored in Microsoft Entra ID.
Right.
So that's an important distinction to make.
Okay, great. So we've got all the definitions.
We made it?
We did it. We did it.
Yeah.
So the article wraps up with some actionable next steps for folks who want to learn more.
Yeah, so if you're interested in those advanced features, they encourage you to sign up for a free 30-day trial of Microsoft Entra ID P1 or P2.
Okay, yeah. And they also recommend associating an Azure subscription with your Microsoft Entra ID. Why is that?
Yeah, so that's because to really use a lot of those advanced features
Mhm.
and to integrate with Azure, you need to have an active Azure subscription.
Okay.
So it's kind of like, the gateway to the rest of Azure.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And lastly, they point to this Microsoft Entra ID P2 feature deployment checklist.
Yeah, that's a really useful resource if you're thinking about implementing those advanced features.
Okay, perfect. So as we wrap up here, it's clear that Microsoft Entra ID is a really central and important, hub
Yeah.
for managing access and security in today's cloud-first world.
Yeah, and it's not just about who can log in, right?
Right.
It's about controlling access to all those different resources. It's about securing those identities.
Mhm.
And it's about meeting those compliance requirements, which are getting more and more complex all the time.
Right. And it's not just for giant enterprises either, right?
No, absolutely not. I mean, if you're using Microsoft 365,
Right.
you're already using Microsoft Entra ID, whether you realize it or not.
Right. Okay. So we're almost out of time here, but this deep dive brings us to a final thought for you, the listener.
Yeah, so we want you to think about this. As
Okay.
it gets more and more complicated to access resources, both inside and outside the organization, how might a centralized identity management system like Microsoft Entra ID change how you think about security and user?